When my wife and I moved into our lakefront property, we were chasing a dream we had nurtured for years. The kind of peace that comes with watching the sun ripple across the water in the early mornings and the sound of loons calling in the distance at night, far removed from the chaos of the city. We had worked hard to buy this place, a beautiful spread of land that gave us access to the lake without anyone else's permission. Something we legally owned outright with the title crystal clear of any neighborhood covenants or mandatory associations. But of course, where there is peace, there always seems to be someone who makes it their life's purpose to disturb it. And in our case, that person was Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the local HOA that operated on the opposite side of the lake. She wasted no time marching over to introduce herself the very day the moving truck pulled out, carrying a clipboard stacked with papers, her sunglasses perched high on her head like some kind of crown, and a smug smile on her lips that told me this woman thought she owned everything in sight. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said sweetly, though her tone carried the bite of expectation rather than sincerity. She shoved a packet into my wife's hands and chirped, "Here are the bylaws for the Lakeview Homeowners Association. Dues are $800 annually, and our board meetings are mandatory for all homeowners. Since you're new, we'll need you to sign these forms today so I can process your membership." My wife, who is one of the most patient yet firm women I know, simply flipped through the pages before politely handing them back. "I'm sorry," she said in a steady voice. "We aren't part of this HOA. Our deed is clean. We checked before buying." That response seemed to hit Karen like a slap, and she drew herself up taller, her smile vanishing into a scowl. "Everyone who lives on this lake is part of the HOA," she snapped. "If you think you're an exception, you're mistaken. We make the rules here about lawn care, dock placement, even what color you can paint your house. If you refuse, you'll be in violation, and believe me, you don't want to get on the wrong side of the board." My wife didn't flinch. She simply said, "We own this property outright. You don't have jurisdiction over us." I thought that would be the end of it, but people like Karen don't retreat, they escalate. Over the next few weeks, she tried every trick in the book. We'd find threatening letters taped to our door, warnings about violations like leaving our kayaks by the shore or installing solar panels on the roof. She would show up unannounced, peering through the windows like she was inspecting us for compliance, and she even tried to bully our neighbors into siding with her. Most ignored her, though a few were too scared to speak against her authority. But the breaking point came one Saturday afternoon. My wife and I were enjoying a barbecue on our deck when Karen stormed over again, this time with two HOA board members in tow. She waved her clipboard like a weapon and declared, "This is your final notice. You're required to join, and if you don't, will involve law enforcement." My wife calmly put down her plate and looked her in the eye. "Go ahead," she said evenly. "Call them. We've got nothing to hide." That was all the invitation Karen needed. And within minutes, she was dialing 911, her voice raised in dramatic outrage as she claimed we were trespassing on HOA property and refusing lawful directives. I nearly laughed at the absurdity, but my wife stayed composed, folding her arms as if daring Karen to dig her own grave deeper. The cops didn't take long to arrive, but to Karen's delight, or so she thought, it wasn't just the local deputies. A sheriff's unit pulled up, lights flashing, and Karen immediately ran over, her face alight with triumph as she launched into a tirade about rebellious newcomers refusing to obey the rules. She barely gave them room to speak as she waved toward us, her shrill voice echoing across the water. But when the sheriff finally approached our deck, the entire situation turned upside down in a way Karen never saw coming. He looked at my wife, his demeanor shifting instantly from stern professionalism to sharp attention, and then, to everyone's shock, he asked her one simple question. "Ma'am, what are your orders?" The silence that followed was so thick, it could have drowned out the waves lapping against the shore. Karen's mouth fell open in disbelief, her grip on her clipboard faltering as the reality of who she had just called down on herself began to sink in. My wife didn't need to raise her voice. The quiet authority she carried spoke louder than anything Karen had ever tried to enforce. Karen stood frozen on the grass, her clipboard clutched like a shield while the sheriff's words hung in the air, echoing in the silence between us. And for the first time since we had met her, she didn't have a single snappy comeback ready on her lips. My wife, calm as ever, simply gave the sheriff a small nod and said, "At ease, Sheriff," her tone so natural and commanding that it was obvious this was not their first interaction, and certainly not one where she had to prove herself. The sheriff straightened slightly, lowering his shoulders as though acknowledging a superior, and Karen's eyes darted back and forth between them in growing confusion. "Wait, what do you mean, orders?" "She's just some woman refusing to join our HOA," Karen sputtered, her voice trembling between indignation and fear, as though she couldn't process why the law wasn't instantly jumping to her defense. The sheriff ignored her entirely and addressed my wife directly. "Ma'am, would you like me to remove these individuals from your property?" That one sentence stripped Karen of the smug confidence she had been wearing since the day we moved in. Her face went pale, her grip tightening on the clipboard until her knuckles whitened and she stammered, "Wait, what? This is HOA jurisdiction. This property belongs to the association. She has to comply with our rules." The sheriff finally turned his gaze on Karen, the weight of his authority bearing down on her like a storm cloud. "Ma'am, this property is not under any HOA covenant. I've seen the county records myself. This land is owned free and clear, and the only authority here belongs to the legal property owner, not to you or your board." He pointed a gloved hand toward my wife. "And in case you haven't realized, you just attempted to file a false report against someone who not only outranks me in federal service, but also has the full backing of the state and county. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" Karen blinked rapidly, her words tripping over themselves as she tried to recover. "Wait, federal service? What are you talking about? She's just his wife." That last word came out like venom, as though my wife's authority couldn't possibly be real. But her desperation was already showing. My wife, unfazed, reached into her jacket and calmly pulled out her credentials, a polished badge gleaming in the sunlight, the kind of badge that spoke volumes without her needing to say a word. Karen staggered back a step as though the sight physically struck her, and the board members who had followed her now shuffled nervously, whispering between themselves. The sheriff gave a curt nod at the badge, his voice firm. "Colonel, if you'd like me to press charges for harassment or trespassing, just say the word." My wife gave him a faint smile. "Not today. A warning will suffice." She then fixed her gaze on Karen, who was trembling, her earlier bravado utterly shattered. "You came here thinking you had power, but let me make this crystal clear," my wife said, her tone calm but carrying the unmistakable edge of authority that came from years of commanding respect in high-stakes environments. "We are not, and will never be, part of your HOA. Our land is independent, and any further attempts to harass us will be treated as criminal acts. Do you understand?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. For once, she had no lecture, no threats, no smug smirk. The sheriff added coldly, "If I get another call from you trying to misuse law enforcement resources for your petty power plays, I will personally ensure you spend the night in county lockup. Do I make myself clear?" Karen's knees almost buckled as she nodded, the clipboard sagging against her chest like a useless prop. The two board members who had come with her muttered apologies under their breath before backing away, clearly realizing they had backed the wrong horse. I stood beside my wife, unable to suppress the pride swelling in my chest, not just because she had handled the situation with grace and authority, but because she had exposed Karen for what she truly was, a bully who thrived only when people were too afraid to stand up to her. The sheriff gave us one final nod before turning to leave, his patrol car crunching down the gravel road, and Karen, humiliated and shaken, muttered something about misunderstandings before retreating quickly down the path with her entourage. But even as she fled, I could see the storm brewing in her eyes. Karen wasn't the kind of woman to give up easily. She had been embarrassed, her false sense of power shattered in front of witnesses, and people like her never take defeat gracefully. My wife must have sensed it too, because as soon as Karen disappeared from view, she turned to me and said quietly, "This isn't over. She's going to come back harder." And she was right. What we didn't know then was that Karen, in her desperation to reclaim control, was about to launch a campaign of intimidation and manipulation unlike anything we had yet seen. In the days that followed, it became clear that Karen's humiliation had not tamed her. It had ignited her into something far more dangerous. A woman on a mission to claw back the control she believed was rightfully hers, and while she no longer had the sheriff or the law at her side, she still had her clipboard, her connections in the HOA, and a boundless appetite for making our lives as miserable as possible. It began with petty annoyances. Anonymous flyers slipped under our door, accusing us of being bad neighbors, threatening letters about fines we supposedly owed for noncompliance, and HOA newsletters circulated around the lake, painting us as selfish rule breakers who thought we were above the community. We ignored these at first, confident that her bluster would burn itself out, but Karen wasn't interested in giving up. She escalated. One evening, as I walked down to the dock, I discovered our kayaks had been dragged into the water and left adrift, their ropes slashed as if to send a message. Another morning, my wife woke to find our mailbox stuffed with garbage, the letters we had received soaked in soda and ruined. Neighbors we had previously exchanged friendly waves with now began avoiding eye contact, clearly influenced by Karen's gossip, while a handful of HOA loyalists would stand at the edge of our property line, arms crossed, as though daring us to confront them. I could feel my patience thinning, but my wife, calm and resolute as ever, simply reminded me, "This is what bullies do. They try to provoke a reaction. We'll document everything and handle it the right way." And she did. Every slashed rope, every vandalized mailbox, every whispered threat was photographed, recorded, and added to a growing file she kept locked in her office. But Karen's obsession only grew. She began showing up again, not directly on our property, but lingering just beyond the property line, her eyes narrowed and her phone out as though she was cataloging supposed violations to report back to her board. On more than one occasion, she would block our driveway with her SUV, claiming she was inspecting drainage ditches or monitoring shoreline compliance, forcing us to call the sheriff's office to move her along. Each time, she left angrier, muttering under her breath about outsiders ruining the lake and special treatment that we didn't deserve. Her antics might have been laughable if not for the way she weaponized her HOA board. Soon, we began receiving official-looking notices stamped with HOA, insignias, threatening legal action if we didn't pay back dues, remove our solar panels, and even cut down trees on our own property because they supposedly obstructed community views. It was nonsense, of course. We weren't members of their HOA and owed them nothing. But to the casual observer, these documents looked legitimate, and Karen knew that perception was power. A few nervous neighbors even came by to ask if we were really defying the HOA, their voices hushed, their eyes darting nervously toward Karen's house as though afraid she might see them talking to us. My wife reassured them gently, explaining the truth, even showing them our deed. But I could tell the pressure was building, and Karen was deliberately sowing seeds of division. The breaking point came when we hosted a small family gathering by the lake one weekend. My parents, my wife's sister, and a few close friends had come to enjoy the water, grill some food, and relax. We were laughing and sharing stories when Karen marched down the slope, this time with nearly a dozen HOA members behind her, all of them armed with cameras, clipboards, and a kind of mob-like energy. She shouted over the music, accusing us of illegally hosting an unregistered lake event, and demanded everyone leave immediately. When my wife calmly told her she had no authority, Karen shrieked, "This is HOA property and you are trespassers," before instructing her little mob to start taking down license plate numbers and threatening to tow cars. It was harassment on a scale we hadn't yet seen, and for a moment I thought my family would be forced to leave under the sheer pressure of her intimidation. But then my wife, without raising her voice, simply pulled out her phone, dialed a number, and said, "This is Colonel name. I need an officer dispatched to my residence immediately. We have an ongoing harassment situation." Within minutes, not only did a patrol car arrive, But two additional units rolled in as well, lights flashing, sirens briefly blaring before cutting out as the deputies stepped onto our lawn. Karen puffed herself up, eager to spin the story first. But before she could even speak, one of the deputies walked straight past her and saluted my wife. The color drained from Karen's face as realization set in once more. She wasn't the most powerful person here, not even close. The deputies dispersed the crowd, warning the HOA members that continued harassment would lead to charges, and Karen, her voice cracking, shouted after them, "You can't protect them forever. The board will sue. We'll make sure they pay." But her words rang hollow, drowned out by the murmurs of disillusioned neighbors who were now beginning to see her for what she truly was, a tyrant hiding behind the illusion of community service. As the deputies left, one of them leaned in close to my wife and said quietly, "She's not going to stop, ma'am. You might want to consider filing for an injunction." My wife nodded, her expression serious. That night, as we sat on the deck watching the last light fade over the water, she turned to me and said, "Karen just declared war. But what she doesn't realize is that she's out of her depth." Karen's so-called war came to a head in ways she probably never anticipated, because once my wife decided to act, she didn't move rashly or emotionally, she moved strategically the way only someone trained in leadership, law, and chain of command could, and what Karen thought would be a neighborhood spat quickly became a full-scale reckoning. My wife spent the next week compiling her meticulously documented evidence into a case file so thorough it could have belonged in a federal courtroom. Photos of the vandalism, recordings of Karen trespassing and issuing threats, copies of every bogus HOA notice and fine, witness statements from neighbors tired of her bullying, and even time-stamped video footage showing her mob harassing our family gathering. She filed for a restraining order, not just against Karen, but also against the HOA as an organization, citing ongoing harassment, intimidation, and attempted fraud. When the court summons arrived, Karen's smug smile had vanished completely, replaced by frantic whispers among her board members about hiring lawyers and protecting the HOA. But the truth was, their entire empire had been built on smoke and mirrors. At the hearing, when Karen tried to claim that we were required to join their association, the judge interrupted her with a simple question. "Can you provide a deed restriction or covenant that proves this property is under your HOA?" She froze, fumbling through her stack of papers, none of which contained a single binding document over our land. My wife calmly produced our deed, highlighted, notarized, and clean, and the courtroom murmured as the judge declared that the HOA had no authority whatsoever over our property and that their actions constituted harassment. Karen tried to pivot, accusing us of being unneighborly and destabilizing the community, but the judge's gavel came down hard, ordering a cease and desist against further contact and warning Karen that any additional harassment could lead to civil damages and criminal charges. The restraining order was granted on the spot, and for the first time, Karen's carefully crafted facade crumbled in public view. Her board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly regretting aligning themselves with her vendetta, and some even avoided eye contact as though already plotting their exit. But my wife wasn't finished. She had also filed complaints with the county and state attorney general's office regarding the HOA's fraudulent notices and misuse of legal threats, and those complaints triggered an official investigation. Within weeks, inspectors arrived at the HOA office, seizing records, auditing dues, and uncovering a laundry list of financial mismanagement that had been swept under the rug for years. Homeowners who had faithfully paid their dues discovered their money had been funneled into vanity projects that benefited Karen and her friends rather than the community, and outrage spread like wildfire around the lake. The same neighbors who once avoided eye contact now came knocking on our door, apologizing for believing Karen's lies and thanking my wife for standing up when no one else dared. And then came the final blow. The sheriff himself arrived one morning, not with questions for us, but with warrants for Karen and two of her closest board members, charging them with harassment, misuse of funds, and filing false reports. I'll never forget the sight of Karen being led away in handcuffs, still sputtering about community rights as the neighbors she once terrorized stood by and watched, some even cheering softly under their breath. For the first time, the lake felt free. Free from her reign of intimidation, free from her endless rules and power games, free from the shadow she had cast over what should have been a peaceful place. In the weeks that followed, the HOA board dissolved, the fraudulent bylaws were struck down, and homeowners voted to disband the association entirely, choosing instead to manage their properties independently without interference. It was poetic justice. Karen's empire didn't just crumble, it imploded, taking with it the illusion of authority she had wielded like a sword for so long. As for us, life returned to the dream we had envisioned when we bought the property. Quiet mornings on the dock, evenings grilling with friends without interruption, and neighbors who now treated us with genuine respect rather than suspicion. My wife, ever humble, never boasted about the victory, but I knew the truth. She hadn't just defended our land, she had liberated an entire community from a tyrant. And she had done it not by screaming or threatening, but by standing firm, using the law, and never letting Karen's bullying shake her resolve. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the lake shimmered in gold, I asked her how she managed to stay so calm through everything. She smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the water, and said, "Because bullies only have as much power as you give them. The moment you stop being afraid, they lose." And with that, we raised our glasses to peace, to freedom, and to the simple truth that no self-appointed HOA queen could ever control us again.